Hi, I'm Vera Parham. I'm a professor in the history department here at APUS, and today I'm going to share with you bits and pieces on my paper on Seattle's Gang of Four. So, with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Bernie Whitebear, Roberto Maestas, Bob Santos, and Larry Gossett, Seattle's Gang of Four, worked from the 1960s to the 1990s to illuminate the inequalities in Seattle's educational, political, judicial, labor, and cultural institutions. Through active protests, the leaders of these four marginalized communities utilized collective action to apply pressure to Seattle and Washington state leaders for successful change, as well as lending their voices to international causes. Whitebear led the United Indians of all tribes. Mastis led the El Centro de la Raza. Gossett led the Black Student Union, and Santos led the Asian Coalition for Equity and sat on the Seattle Human Rights Commission. Working together, their protests drew international attention through not just their headline-grabbing tactics, but for their unique coalition. These leaders parlayed their community and media success into political power by working with city and state politicians who believed in social equity. The Gang of Four took their name from the catchy headlines about the Chinese Communist counter-revolutionaries who masterminded the worst excesses of the Cultural Revolution, not due to any similarities with their policies. They represent groups with very different histories, but with similar goals and similar relationships to city and state authorities. Their cross-cultural mobilization informed the paths they took in their activism and the outcomes of that activism. The social movements championed by the Gang of Four were diverse and experienced varying degrees of success. However, they generally followed a similar pattern of protest, resistance to police action, attention to the press, and negotiations with political leadership. Whether it was for space to create community centers, attention to police brutality, lack of diversity in education, or protection of housing from development, the Gang of Four spent most of the 1970s and 80s applying pressure to the city of Seattle to recognize the underrepresented in their city. Their activism grew to support international causes like the Sandinistas, a group opposed by President Reagan for their leftist policies in Nicaragua. They also backed movements questioning the labor policies of globalizations. As one later activist noted, they helped, quote, bring credibility to credible causes and gave voice to the disenfranchised. Today, Seattle is viewed as a bastion of liberality, an image promoted by boosters in the 1950s and enshrined in the construction of the futuristic Space Needle for the 1962 World's Fair. But the history of the city, like most American cities, is one of exclusion and racial and social segregation. The city that derives its name from South, a Duwamish and Suquamish leader, rests on lands wrested from multiple indigenous tribes over decades of white American settlement. During the 1960s, Seattle, like many cities across the United States, experienced the effects of racial segregation, systemic racism, and disparities in housing, education, and employment opportunities. While Seattle was not subject to the same degree of legal segregation as southern states, racial discrimination was still pervasive, particularly against African American and Asian American communities. As Bob Santos would later point out, Seattle was a victim of vast economic racism. World War II brought in growing numbers of Black, Filipino, and Mexican workers to the urban area and increased the small Native American and Chinese and Japanese American population already in the city. Though the population of the city remained predominantly white in the 1960s, about 85%. While numerically the smallest population, the first people of the region were at the forefront of the modern protest movement. The focus on fishing rights preserved and the many treaties signed with the indigenous people around Seattle led to an awareness that tactics to preserve legal and cultural rights would need to change course. What would become known as Fishins began in the 1950s, and these protests were training grounds for Seattle's activist community. These protests were a means of proving the fishing rights of the treaty-signing tribes of the Pacific Northwest, as well as illustrating the cultural and economic necessity of fish to the indigenous people of the region. Groups of Indian fishermen from all across the state would gather at locations where Indians had previously been arrested for fishing without licenses, in which they considered usual and accustomed places, and there they would fish until they too were arrested. Individuals organized various protests and slowly built a cohesive movement. Fish-in organizers came from all across Washington state and from beyond the Native American community. Of the Gang of Four, both Bernie Whitebear and Roberto Maestas would find their early activism shaped by participation in fish-ins. And by the 1960s, the fish-ins had become a broad coalition movement. The next big push for civil rights would coalesce around housing issues. Housing segregation was a significant issue in Seattle during this time, with many neighborhoods effectively closed off to African American residents due to restrictive covenants and redlining practices by banks and real estate companies. The Central District, historically a predominantly African American neighborhood, became a focal point for efforts to combat housing discrimination and promote racial integration. In addition to the African American community, Asian American communities, including Japanese Americans who had experienced internment and the loss of their homes and businesses during World War II, also faced discrimination and marginalization. Asian American activists in Seattle advocated for civil rights, immigrant rights, and recognition of their contributions to the city's economy and culture. Together, Asian American and African American groups built larger ventures like neighborhood crime prevention, daycare centers, and elder care, as well as a civil rights coordinating committee. St. Peter Clavier Center in the International District was the heart of Seattle's social movement, acting as a meeting hall and planning center for numerous protests. The center, initially run by Father Harvey McIntyre, opened its doors to numerous organizations focused on civil rights. It was the home of the Catholic Interracial Council, the Central Area Civil Rights Committee, the United Construction Workers Association, a union founded by Tyree Scott focused on protecting the rights of minority construction workers, the Asian Coalition for Equity, the Marian Club of Catholic Women, the Blackfeet Indian of Montana tribal members, and the Black Panthers of Seattle. With meetings held by different organizations every night, attendance was always cross-pollinated. Due to the intense use of St. Peter's space, meetings overlapped and organization membership grew. So many activist organizations met at St. Peter Clavers that the auditorium was booked 2 to 3 times per week for rallies, while the social hall accommodated events like the Black Panthers breakfasts. The first member of the Gang of Four to involve himself with the center was Bob Santos. Santos was a tireless advocate for the downtown area known initially as Chinatown and later as the International District. The International District was the heart of Seattle's Asian American community and the birthplace of Bob Santos, son of Filipino immigrants. He was raised by his boxer father and politically savvy uncle, who taught him to fight for what was right for his community. Indeed, the Asian American community once dubbed him the unofficial mayor of Chinatown. He had an ability to maintain street credibility with grassroots organizations while skillfully negotiating for social services among top government officials. In the early 1960s, Bob joined the Catholic Interracial Council, an organization focused on achieving racial equality for all Seattle's minoritized communities. The CIC, like the Gang of Four, believed the best way to create opportunity for marginalized groups and fight social injustice was to draw public attention and press coverage to issues through protest. Santos's first march was with the Catholic Interracial Council in support of the Open Housing Bill of 1964. After a rainy day struggling to carry a heavy banner, Santos vowed to never participate in a civil rights march again. But seeing his picture on the cover of the local Catholic newspaper soon changed his mind. Civil rights were not just about black and white, he realized. All minoritized communities needed to work together as they often suffered under the same unjust laws and practices. Bob seemed to be everywhere at once in the later decades of the 20th century. He invited activists into his community and, quote, socializing in bars and lounges in the ID was an important part of getting to know other people in the community. As he noted, quote, it wasn't all fun and games. We actually conducted business in those lounges and bars. Santos built coalitions through friendship and gentle pressure. He would say, we need all of you and your friends to pack the city council hearings and let the city officials know that they've got to act on behalf of your interests. The St. Peter Clavier Center housed meetings of the Black Panthers, one of the many activist groups Larry Gossett played a role in. He was born and raised in Seattle and knew firsthand the insidious nature of de facto segregation, as his parents were denied home loans in several Seattle neighborhoods. Larry had dreams of playing college basketball, but his father wanted him to focus on academics. In 1963, he enrolled at the University of Washington. He began working in a youth program in Harlem, New York in 1966, and it was there he began his activist career. He attended the West Coast Black Power Youth Conference in LA and soon after helped to found the Black Student Union at the University of Washington. Larry believed the Black Student Union could make traditional educational systems more accountable to Black Americans. Their first major protest was a sit-in at Franklin High School in support of racial policies, which forced females to straighten their hair and harshly penalized male students for fighting. The Seattle Human Rights Commission intervened and pressured the school to change policies. Larry and other protesters were arrested and charged at the sit-in, but refused to back down. They took demands for a Black Studies program as well as campus support for Black students to the president of the University of Washington in 1968 and won an agreement to meet all of their demands. Larry Gossett went on to direct the Central Area Motivation Project, the city's largest and oldest anti-poverty agency, and later he would serve multiple terms on the King County Council, protecting the rights of not just Seattle's African American community, but all the often overlooked citizens of King County. As his campaign flyer stated, "Why elect someone who will represent some of us when we can have Larry Gossett represent all of us?" Though born in New Mexico, Roberto Maestas also attended the UW. He worked hard to put himself through college, and upon graduating in 1965, joined Franklin High School as a Spanish teacher. As a teacher, he witnessed the sit-in organized by the BSU and Gossett and was impressed with the power of social activism. Roberto became friends with the Bridges family, leaders in the Native American fishing rights struggle of the Nisqually tribe at Frank's Landing. Through them, he was exposed to the power of direct action protest and the preservation of cultural rights. Larry's fight for opportunities for minority students at the UW brought a small wave of Chicano youth to campus. Roberto joined this group in promoting not only students' rights, but farm workers' rights through the Chicano student movement. The group was successful in boycotting non-union grapes on campus, and the UW was the first college to remove non-union grapes from its facilities. Like every member of the Gang of Four, Maestas was well known for fighting for the rights of all Seattle citizens. In fact, the FBI kept a file on Maestas to which they labeled him a professional rabble-rouser. In 1973, Maestas, Santos, Gossett, and White Bear founded the Minority Coalition for an Equitable Revenue Sharing System, representatives of the four major ethnic minority groups in Seattle: Black, Chicano, Asian, and Indian communities. In advocating for equitable funding of community projects before the Seattle City Council, Maestas stated, quote, "We think that your priority should not be getting the city all beautified up for convention goers. We're asking for human value, because I don't believe that there is a building in this whole city that is worth the life of one individual." Maestas' most notable protest created the El Centro de la Raza, Seattle's important community center for Spanish-speaking and indeed all peoples. In October 1972, an old elementary school in North Beacon Hills sat vacant. Maestas rallied a group of Chicano and Chicana and their supporters to occupy the building and demand a community center. For the next few months, the protesters were joined by Larry Gossett and Bernie Whitebear in their occupation of the old school. Finally, their occupation paid off, and the Seattle City School District agreed to lease the building for a nominal fee. El Centro de la Raza was born. Maestas and his staff set up a food bank, a daycare center, and offices for coordinating social services and healthcare for Seattle's Spanish-speaking community, and indeed anyone who came to the center for help. The glue that held the Gang of Four together was Bernie Whitebear. Born Bernard Reyes on the Colville Indian Reservation in eastern Washington to a Filipino father and Sinec's mother, Bernie's laid-back and congenial personality seemed little suited for political activism. After high school, Bernie moved to the Puget Sound region. There he put himself through a few years at the University of Washington. Bernie found his calling while living in Tacoma, Washington. His brother Lonnie Reyes remembered Bernie recognizing the problems faced by urban Indians around him and thinking, "Well, I'm going to devote my life to helping my people." According to his brother, Bernie never married or had a family because of his complete dedication to his cause. White Bear decided, "I've got to do something because it's steadily going downhill and every time it gets worse." According to Lonnie, Bernie was going to devote his life to changing this somehow. He knew he was making a difference for those people. Bernie gained his early education in activism when he went fishing with his friend Robert Satayacum on the Puyallup Reservation in Tacoma. The two men often found themselves arrested for fishing out of season and had their gear confiscated. Bernie participated in numerous fishing protests over the years, first in Tacoma on the Puyallup Reservation and later at Frank's Landing. Bernie Whitebear was one of the many Native Americans profoundly inspired by the 1970 occupation of Alcatraz Island by the Indians of all tribes. He formed the United Indians of All Tribes, and in March 1970, they and their supporters, including the Black Panthers and Larry Gossett, stormed the lands of Fort Lawton outside Seattle in an attempt to claim the area for the future site of an urban Indian community center. They were expelled, but formed a picket line and refused to back down, and eventually, not far from the very spot where on April 2nd, 1970, the final confrontation between protesters and police had occurred, the Daybreak Star Indian Cultural Center arose. Today, Daybreak is a gathering space, a social services coordinating organization, a daycare and elder care facility, an arts market, and the host of Seattle's yearly powwow. In a way, the Gang of Four represent the complex mix of identities in the city of Seattle. They were not all part of a specifically defined minoritized community, but they supported the idea that protests could build group solidarity and gain access to government reform and funding. As UIAT member Randy Lewis said, the only way to get support is by supporting others. You could say there was the Indian, the Black, the Asian, the Mexican American, and the hippies. I won't forget them because they championed us. When the other ethnic groups came in, then they did have an impact. It created a fist, all the fingers being different parts. It was quite an impact. Their acts of protest solidified membership in specific ethnic groups while creating a broader activist identity. Lonnie Reyes recalled, they drink and became all friends and they could trust each other. And this is all important when you're trying to weld something together. It was a common ethnic effort, I guess. The Game of Four never claimed to achieve their success on their own. Numerous other activists fought side by side with the Four, the most notable of whom was Tyree Scott, founder of the United Construction Workers Association. Seattle has a long-standing history of labor activism, and Tyree was willing to go to any lengths to ensure Black, Latino, and women construction workers were hired at large, well-paying projects like the SeaTac Airport and the University of Washington campus. It wasn't all protest and city hall hearings for the Gang of Four. They supported one another financially, emotionally, and practically. In 1975, the International District Improvement Association, headed by Bob Santos, built the International District Community Garden. They relied upon volunteers to help spread truckloads of topsoil. Roberto Maestas brought staff from El Centro de la Raza. Larry Gossett came with members of the Central Area Motivation Program, and Bernie Whitebear brought the United Indians of All Tribes from Daybreak. Bernie, ever savvy in the PR department, also brought the press, and so snagged the next day's Post-Intelligencer headline, quote, Indians build garden for Asian elderly. The various modes of communication from protest to political agitation differed depending on the participants and the target audience, as well as the goals of that communication. From testifying for one another to support housing and social service programs to protest to volunteering in one another's cleanups, planting or building campaigns, the Gang of Four secured more for their respective communities together than any could alone. When they needed help, when they met with the Seattle City Council, all four would appear representing their groups. And it worked pretty good, because the council knew that they're not just dealing with one group, they were dealing with all four every time these guys showed up. Their images grace murals and even stained glass in the Seattle Center. Streets and public buildings are named after them. The social service programs they implemented are still running, with El Centro de la Raza continuing to expand. According to Bob Santos, quote, a lot of people didn't care for activists back in the old days, but we learned how to work the system. Some of us moved into positions where we could make a difference, and we got a lot of things done and built. That's a legacy we can look back on with pride. Something for the next generation to build on. Though the Gang of Four is now only one, Larry Gossett, their legacy lives on in powerful ways. In 2000, at Bernie Whitebear's funeral, the remaining three members served as his pallbearers. Santos remembers a huge gust of wind blowing through the construction site for Bernie's hoped-for expansion of Daybreak. His spirit was still hard at work. The spirit of the Gang of Four will long watch over the city of Seattle and remind city leaders to pay close attention to the needs of their minoritized constituents.